The world held its breath, watching a centuries-old tradition of impeccable perfection. As the queen's coffin, borne by her grandsons, passed the lines of motionless, bearskin-clad guardsmen, every movement was a choreography of grief and respect. Then, one soldier broke. In a shocking fracture of protocol, he stepped forward, out of the rigid formation, his polished boot hitting the gravel with a crunch that echoed in the global silence. He did not salute. He did not stand at attention. Instead, he did something so deeply personal, so utterly human, that it sliced through the pomp and circumstance, leaving a billion witnesses frozen, wondering what secret, what profound debt of the heart, could compel a man to defy history itself at its most sacred moment. The morning of the Queen's state funeral dawned clear and cold over London. The city, usually a roaring beast of energy, had been subdued into a respectful hush. Miles of barriers lined the procession route, behind which a silent, multi-layered sea of people stood shoulder to shoulder. They had camped for days, united in a shared, solemn purpose. Above, the sky was a pale, unforgiving blue, as if holding its breath. Among the thousands of soldiers deployed for the historic day, Guardsman Aaron McCleary stood as a statue in scarlet and bearskin. His position, on the edge of the gravel path leading to the steps of the chapel, was one of high visibility. To the world, he was just another part of the magnificent, unblinking tapestry of royal tradition, a faceless emblem of duty. His muscles ached from the hours of absolute stillness, but the pain was a familiar companion, a penance he welcomed. His eyes, fixed on a point in the middle distance, saw not the gathered dignitaries or the waiting cameras, but memories. They were memories of a different sky, the damp green hills of the Scottish Highlands near Balmoral, and a much smaller, quieter funeral that had happened 13 years ago. Aaron was not a man of lofty birth or grand connections. He was from a village in the shadow of the Cairngorms, the son of a gamekeeper and a schoolteacher. His entry into the Scots Guards, one of the oldest regiments in the British Army, was a source of fierce pride for his family. His first summer posting as a young, incredibly nervous soldier was to Balmoral Castle for the royal family's annual retreat. It was there, on his third day, fumbling with a piece of fencing he was meant to be repairing by a remote cottage, that he had first spoken to her. She was walking her dogs, dressed in a well-worn wax jacket and a headscarf, and mistook him for a local estate worker. She asked about the health of the red deer on the higher slopes, her knowledge precise and practical. When he stammered that he was a new guardsman, not a ghillie, she simply smiled, asked his name, and told him the best way to mend the broken post. That was Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. No fanfare, no formality, just a quiet, practical woman who knew the land. Over successive summers, their unlikely acquaintanceship grew. She would often walk that path. Sometimes she was with family or important guests, and he would snap to rigid attention. But sometimes she was alone, and she would pause, ask after his parents, comment on the weather, or point out a bird of prey circling overhead. Once, when his father was terribly ill, she had, upon hearing it from a concerned equerry who'd noticed Aaron's distraction, sent a brief, handwritten note to the family. It wasn't a royal gesture, it was a human one. "I am so sorry to hear about your father," it read. "I hope he finds comfort. The land misses his careful hands." His father, a staunch Republican in theory, had wept and placed the note in his Bible. He survived, and forever after spoke of that good woman up at the castle. For Aaron, the Queen became a fixed point in his life, a constant of surprising kindness wrapped in unwavering duty. She represented a Britain that felt steadfast and personal. When he stood guard, he wasn't just protecting a monarch. He was, in his heart, watching over the lady who remembered his name and asked about the heather. Her death, though expected, had hit him with a private, profound grief he shared with millions, yet is felt threaded with personal loss. Now, the muffled drums began their slow, heartbreaking rhythm. The gun carriage bearing the coffin appeared, a simple wreath atop the dark wood. The world's leaders, kings and presidents, prime ministers and princes, all walked behind it. The silence was so absolute it had a weight of its own, broken only by the clockwork cadence of the procession and the distant chime of a bell. Aaron's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic prisoner in his rigid chest. This was it, the final journey. He watched the young grandchildren, faces etched with a very personal, raw sorrow, bearing the weight of history and family loss. As they drew level with him, something within Aaron snapped. The discipline of a decade, the drilled-in protocol, the fear of consequences, all of it evaporated. A deeper, older imperative took over. He moved. One deliberate, clean step forward, out of the straight, unbroken line of his comrades. The crunch of his boot on the gravel was deafening in the televised silence. A billion people gasped. Camera lenses, previously focused on the coffin, swiveled to him. A senior officer's eyes widened in sheer horror. Protocol was being shattered on live television before the eyes of the world. But Aaron was not looking at the cameras or his commanders. His eyes were on the coffin. He brought his rifle down from his shoulder, not in a formal present arms, but to hold it securely at his side. Then, with his free hand, he reached into a small, hidden pocket on his tunic. He pulled out a single, weathered sprig of white heather, tied with a simple piece of green thread. He had picked it from near his father's cottage in Scotland 2 days prior, a piece of the land she loved. He did not throw it onto the coffin. He did not speak. He simply held it aloft for a long, trembling moment, his eyes glistening, his face a mask of naked grief and respect. It was a Highland gesture, a silent, personal farewell to a neighbor, not a subject to his sovereign. Then, he gently placed the sprig of heather on the gravel, directly in the path where the pallbearers had just walked, a tiny, white token on the gray stone. He stepped back, seamlessly rejoining the formation, his eyes once again fixed ahead, as if turned to stone. The entire act had taken less than 15 seconds. The procession, after a barely perceptible hitch, moved on. But the world had stopped. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just the silence of respect. It was the silence of profound, collective shock, etched with a sudden, dawning understanding. This was no act of rebellion. It was an act of love. The shockwave emanating from the gravel path was instantaneous and global. In control trucks, television producers hissed into headsets, demanding close-ups and replays. Social media, which had been a stream of somber emojis and respectful tributes, exploded. The clip of the guardsman's step, the reach into his pocket, the offering of the heather, was isolated, zoomed in, and broadcast again and again. Headlines, previously pre-written solemn statements, were frantically rewritten. Unbreakable guard broken by grief. A heather tribute. Soldier defies protocol. The guardsman's silent goodbye. But, within the rigid hierarchy of the military, the reaction was one of icy, furious dismay. To the senior officers coordinating the once-in-a-century event, Guardsman McCleary's action was the single greatest possible breach. It was a stain on the regiment's flawless record, a potential international embarrassment, a wild card in a ceremony designed to eliminate all uncertainty. As soon as the funeral service began within the chapel, Aaron was quietly, but firmly, extracted from his position by 2 stone-faced regimental sergeants major. He was marched to a stark, utilitarian office in the bowels of Wellington Barracks. He was not placed under arrest, not yet, but the atmosphere was one of severe disciplinary anticipation. He was ordered to sit, still in his full ceremonial uniform, now feeling like a costume of shame. The man who faced him was Colonel Jeffrey Thorpe, a man whose entire career was a monument to protocol. Thorpe's face was granite. "Guardsman McCleary," he began, his voice dangerously quiet. "Explain to me what in God's name you were thinking. You have just compromised the most watched ceremonial event in history. You have turned a global moment of unity into a circus act centered on yourself. Do you have any concept of the damage you have done?" Aaron sat straight-backed, his hands on his knees. The adrenaline had drained, leaving a hollow, cold certainty. "Sir, I offer no excuse for breaking formation. I accept the consequences. But I was not thinking of the world, or the cameras, or the formation." "Then, what were you thinking of?" Thorpe snapped. "A personal moment of vanity? A desire for fame?" "No, sir," Aaron said, his Scottish accent thickening with emotion. "I was thinking of a promise. And of a thank you that was never said." He began to speak, his voice low but steady. He told the colonel not of the public figure, but of the private woman. He spoke of the broken fence, the conversations about deer stocks, and the weather, the note for his father. He described the Queen's knowledge of the local families, her sharp, dry humor when she saw him struggling with a new piece of kit, her preference for Wellington's overdressed shoes on the estate. He painted a picture not of a distant icon, but of a tangible human presence, a constant in the landscape of his life and his family's life. "The heathers, sir," Aaron continued, seeing the colonel's stern expression flicker, just for a millisecond. "It was from near my home. My dad, before he passed last year. He said to me, "When her time comes, son, and if you're there, you make sure she knows the land remembers her kindness." It wasn't an order. It was a wish. When I stepped forward, I wasn't a guardsman saying goodbye to his commander-in-chief. I was Aaron McCleary, a man from the Highlands, saying farewell to the lady from the big house who was good to my family. It was a final token from the glens she loved. That's all, sir. Colonel Thorpe was silent for a long time. He had devoted his life to the idea of service to the crown, a concept built on structure, tradition, and unwavering discipline. What McCleary described was service of a different kind, a personal, feudal loyalty that bypassed all the formal structures and went straight to the heart. It was messy, it was uncontrollable, and it was profoundly human. He had seen the Queen smile at troopings of the color, her genuine interest in the soldiers. He knew, in his heart, that the young guardsman's story rang true. The breach was grievous, but the motive was pure. It was a cultural clash of immense proportions, the unstoppable force of raw, personal grief meeting the immovable object of centuries of military tradition. Meanwhile, outside the barracks, the story was evolving without facts. Theories ran wild. Was he a disgruntled soldier making a protest? Was he ill? Had he received a secret signal? Then, a local journalist from Aberdeen, who had once done a story on Balmoral estate workers, remembered a brief mention years ago of a young guardsman from a gamekeeper's family who'd had a kind word from the Queen. He made a call. Soon, a different narrative began to pierce the noise, a story of a personal, years-long connection, of quiet kindnesses remembered. This wasn't a stunt. It was a poignant, human epilogue to the Queen's long reign, revealed not by a biographer or a palace statement, but by a single, brave, and costly act of a soldier. The public sentiment, initially shocked, began a powerful, palpable shift. The silent, simple offering of heather started to symbolize something the grand ceremony could not: the unscripted, personal impact of a life lived in service. Colonel Thorpe dismissed Aaron, ordering him to remain in his quarters pending a formal inquiry. The weight of his actions now fully upon him, Aaron felt a strange calm. He had done what his heart demanded. The consequences were secondary. He removed his bearskin and tunic, the smell of wool and polish suddenly overwhelming. As he sat on his narrow bunk, his phone, finally, returned to him, buzzed incessantly. Unknown numbers, messages from bewildered friends, and anxious family. He did not answer. Across the city, in a private drawing room of one of the royal residences, a different conversation was taking place. King Charles III, now bearing the colossal weight of his new title, had been debriefed on the incident. He had seen the clip. His initial reaction, as the new head of the armed forces, was one of concern for the sanctity of the ceremony. But then he watched it again, closely. He saw not the uniform first, but the man's face. He saw the grief, the determination, the final, gentle placement of the heather. It reminded him of something. He sent for his private secretary. "Do we know anything more about this guardsman?" McCleary, wasn't it? "A full report is being prepared by the Scots Guards, Your Majesty." "A clear breach, of course. Disciplinary action is imminent." Charles waved a hand, a gesture eerily reminiscent of his mother when she wanted to cut through officialese. Yes. But, beyond the report, his story. The secretary, understanding the shift in focus, relayed the fragments beginning to emerge: the Balmoral connection, the gamekeeper father, the anecdote about the handwritten note. A slow, sad recognition dawned on the king's face. "Of course," he murmured, almost to himself. The McClearys. From near the Linn of D. Wonderful man, the father. Knew every bird on the estate. Mother taught at the village school for 40 years. He remembered his mother speaking of them, not as subjects, but as part of the Balmoral community she cherished above all. He remembered her saying, after a walk one autumn, "I saw a young McCleary today, the one in the Guards. His father is poorly. Such a good family." To the king, this changed everything. His mother's reign was built on a million such small, unseen connections. This public breach was, in its essence, a testament to that very private aspect of her sovereignty. It was not an insult to her memory, but a fierce, flawed, and beautiful tribute to it. He instructed his secretary to contact the regimental colonel. The message was not an order. A constitutional monarch does not interfere in military discipline. But it was a powerful sentiment. While the mechanisms of the army must run their course, it might be worth considering that Her late Majesty valued personal loyalty above perfect pageantry, and often found her greatest comfort in the simple loyalty of those who lived on the land she loved. This quiet message from the palace, when conveyed to Colonel Thorpe, acted as a seismic guide. It did not absolve McCleary, but it reframed the context entirely. The inquiry was no longer just about a breach. It was about evaluating an act of profound, if unorthodox, fealty. Thorpe called in his senior advisors. The debate was fierce. Some argued for a court-martial to uphold absolute discipline. Others, swayed by the human story and the palace's tacit understanding, argued for a more nuanced response. The army was at a crossroads. Could it acknowledge the power of the human heart without breaking its own essential code? While the machinery of the institution ground on, the world had embraced the story. The image of the white heather on the gray gravel became an iconic symbol. People began leaving small posies of heather at palace gates and war memorials. In Scotland, the gesture was universally understood. It was an act, a kindness remembered and returned. Aaron McCleary, in his barracks room, was unaware that he had become a symbol. He was just a soldier who missed his friend, waiting for the judgment of the only other family he had, the army. The formal inquiry was swift. 2 days after the funeral, Guardsman Aaron McCleary stood before a closed military tribunal. The atmosphere was grave, but the predictable anger had been tempered by the extraordinary circumstances. Colonel Thorpe presented the facts, the unequivocal breach of orders, the global spectacle, the potential undermining of discipline. Then, he did something unusual. He allowed Aaron to speak in full, not just in his own defense, but to explain. Aaron, in his service dress uniform, repeated his story, this time with even quieter conviction. He brought with him the faded, carefully preserved note the Queen had sent his father, now enclosed in a clear plastic sleeve. He provided statements from his mother and from a retired Balmoral Gilly who corroborated the nature of the Queen's interactions. He was not defiant. He was resigned, yet clear. I served Her Majesty with every ounce of my being for 10 years, he concluded, his voice firm. That step forward felt, in that moment, like the final, most important part of that service. I am sorry for the disruption it caused my comrades and my regiment, whom I respect deeply. But I am not sorry for saying goodbye in the way my heart demanded. The tribunal deliberated. The factors were immense. The need for discipline, the overwhelming public sentiment which now heavily favored the guardsmen, the unique context of a historic funeral, and the subtle guidance from the palace. The decision, when it came, was a masterpiece of military compromise. Aaron was found to have committed a serious breach of the Queen's regulations. His action could not be, and would not be, officially condoned. As such, he was to be reassigned. He would not face a court-martial or a dishonorable discharge, but he could no longer serve in the public-facing ceremonial duties of the household division. His bearskin and scarlet tunic were to be handed in. However, in recognition of his otherwise spotless record and the mitigating, highly unique context of profound personal loyalty, his reassignment would be to a regiment that prized initiative and deep connection to the land. He was to be transferred to the Royal Regiment of Scotland, with his rank intact, and with a recommendation for consideration for a specialist role in mountain and Arctic warfare training, based in the very highlands he called home. It was, in effect, a return to his roots. A gentle, honorable exile from the spotlight he never sought. When Aaron was told the verdict, a wave of relief and profound sadness washed over him. He was losing the brotherhood of the guards, the life he knew. But he was being allowed to continue to serve and to go home. He accepted the judgment without complaint. The army issued a terse, official statement. A full inquiry has been conducted into the incident involving a guardsman during the state funeral. The matter has been dealt with internally through administrative measures. The soldier remains a member of the armed forces. No further comment will be made. It was a classic military brush-off, designed to close the book. But the world wanted more. A well-respected broadcaster managed to secure the first interview with Aaron after his discharge from ceremonial duties, just before his transfer north. It was conducted in a plain room, Aaron in a simple sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable without the uniform. He was hesitant, uncomfortable with the attention, but sincere. He repeated his story, not as a performance, but as a quiet testimony. When asked about the heather, he said, "It wasn't from me. It was from the land. She was its guardian, and it loved her back. I was just the hand that carried it." The interview, when it aired, finally gave the public the voice behind the act. His humility, his lack of grandiosity, and his clear, deep affection for the queen as a person, not an institution, turned the last of the skeptics. He was not a hero or a rebel. He was a man who grieved deeply and acted truly. The story reached its emotional conclusion for the public. The silent, noble guardsman had spoken, and his reason had, indeed, left everyone with a respectful, understanding silence. 3 months later, autumn painted the Cairngorms in gold and rust. Aaron McCleary, now wearing the muted tartan of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, was on a training exercise, leading a squad across a steep, heather-clad ridge. The wind carried the clean, sharp smell of peat and pine. Here, in the vast, silent landscape, he felt a peace he hadn't known in years. The media storm had subsided. He was just another soldier, albeit one with a story his new comrades respectfully never mentioned. His life had simplified. He lived in a small cottage nearer to his mother. The pace was different, the duty less about perfection and more about endurance, skill, and camaraderie. He thought of the queen often, but the sharp pain had dulled to a fond, steady ache. He had said his goodbye. Unbeknownst to him, a small package arrived at the barracks for him. It was a plain, sturdy box, postmarked from London. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was his old bearskin, not to be worn again, but cleaned and preserved. Beneath it was a simple, elegant card. The handwriting was unfamiliar, formal yet kind. It was from the king's private secretary, acting on instruction. Guardsman McCleary, it read. It was felt you should have this, as a private token of appreciation for your service to Her late Majesty, and for your demonstration of a loyalty she valued above all. Your new regiment is fortunate to have you. The heather has been placed within the Balmoral Estate archives, with a note recording its origin. It will remain there, with the history of the land she loved. There was no signature, just the embossed royal cipher. Aaron held the bearskin, the weight of it familiar and heavy. He wasn't being reinstated, he was being acknowledged. His act, which had been a crisis for the army and a spectacle for the world, was being quietly, personally validated by the family it was meant for. It was the closure he hadn't known he needed. Weeks later, on a clear, frosty morning, Aaron was given a rare day's leave. He drove to a quiet spot on the Balmoral estate, a place he knew she had favored for picnics, overlooking the River Dee. He did not wear his uniform. He was just a man visiting a memory. As he stood there, a familiar figure walked a corgi along the opposite bank. It was the king. He was alone, but, for a security detail lingering at a discreet distance. Charles saw Aaron, and, for a moment, both men stood still. Then, the king did not wave, nor did he summon him over. Instead, he simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of recognition and thanks from one man who had lost her to another. Then, he turned and continued his walk, the dog trotting at his heels. Aaron felt a final knot of tension release. No words were needed. His gesture had been silent, and the understanding was silent too. It was complete. He had broken the most perfect formation in the world for a reason only a heart could understand, and, in the end, that heart had been seen and quietly answered. He got back in his car and drove home, the Scottish sun low and bright in the sky, the land rolling out before him, eternal and steadfast. The story of the guardsman who broke ranks was over, but the life of Aaron McCleary, who had been true to his duty as he saw it, was just beginning again, back where it all started, under the same wide sky.